Our next interview is with Jon Pontius, and Jon has written a book, and it has a lot of information on it. We're going to kind of turn over to Jon and let us tell a little bit about himself, and then he's going to read some excerpts out of his book, and we'll let him go and tell us where he wants it.
Okay. I grew up, I was born in 1939 and grew up on a farm 5.5 miles northeast of Columbia City in Thorn Creek Township, right across the river from Blue River Church. And most of the time the farm was 138 acres. It was a family farm, and we all happily worked together to make a go of it. My sister, my brother, and myself, and my mother and father. And we never, my mother and father, the distinctive thing about them was that they weren't so focused on making the farm, making a lot of money on the farm and making it and expanding it. They were really most interested in their lives in the community and how they could make the community better and better. And my mother, I remember, was a district Methodist Church president and county president of a SNL, county SNL leadership. My father was the 4-H Fair Board chairman for 7 years, and president of the board of directors of the Farm Bureau Co-op for about 10 years. And this was where he spent a lot of his time and his main effort in life. And so that was their main contribution. Actually, this is not about me and a farm. I left the farm to go to college, and I never really came back until 1999. And I moved into the second house on the farm where my mother lived when I understood that when we understood that she would never come back from the nursing home. And it's the house where I first lived. And it was my brother who really has been the farmer since my mother and father. I remember him probably feeling that when he was just a kid, he was meant to farm all of his life. And I remember him playing in the sand pile under the big maple with toy tractors and other implements, and spending many hours there. And so when he grew up, he married a local farm girl 2 or 3 miles north of here, Betty Kitson, and they had their ups and downs like a lot of farmers, and which I may describe later. And when Betty died, and when she was 58, my brother went ahead and married another farm girl, Alice, who has made a major contribution in keeping the place looking beautiful. And but I'm really happy that I grew up on this farm in that particular time and that particular era. And there were a lot of positive influences back then. Like I had a chance to work with around nature all the time, and there weren't very many negative influences back in the 50s when I grew up. And I, like my sister and brother, were big in 4-H, and I remember taking maybe 8 or 9 projects a couple years. I love to collect leaves, and my entomology project was for like 5 or 6 years, and I remember taking my collection to the state fair 2 or 3 years. And I was in the soil conservation project, and then my favorite project was dairy. And I remember the first year I was not able to show my calf because we didn't have the right vaccination papers and evidence. And then I remember the next year in 4-H, I had high hopes, and I remember the calf I had got the white ribbon, which is the worst you could get. And then things changed. When I was 13 in 1952, and this is the way life goes. You know, you have your ups and downs, and I remember during the summer in the dairy club, there was a professor from Purdue, I believe, in dairy husbandry, who showed us all what an ideal dairy calf like mine should look like, you know, and when they're judged at the fair. And I went home to see what my calf was, how it compared to the ideal. And I realized that my calf had, her name was Sarah, had the ideal qualities that he was talking about, or seemed to. And so I remember looking at her real carefully off and on, and I remember even climbing up partway on the silo and looking down and seeing, boy, she really must be good. And so I remember, I don't remember saying anything about this to anybody, but at the fair, I remember when we took her in that night before, I remember looking at the other calves to see how she compared and wondering about what might happen, just like any 13-year-old kid might do. And there were a lot of farms who kind of loved to show cattle at fairs and win whatever they could, and if there weren't adult open shows, their kids would show, and so I figured I didn't have a chance, but I remember before I took her out and to show, I remember saying, "Come on, Sarah, you can do it, you can do it." And she did win. She won the grand championship of the Holstein breed at the fair that year. And this was really a big thing. All the other things, successes I had in 4-H, for some reason didn't seem to compare to the good luck of having the champion Holstein calf at the fair. And so so that was a big part of our lives. My mom and dad actually met in 4-H. And so this was, the fair was really kind of the big point of our lives in a lot of ways. You know, spent a lot of time preparing for the fair, and I remember wondering when I was a kid why anybody would want to miss the fair, you know, and anything after that was dull. So 4-H was really educational in a lot of ways. I think my dad had the right perspective, and my 4-H leader, Leon Alder, also had the right perspective in not pushing me to want to win all the time, but just to do a good job and keep learning. And I appreciate that more now than I probably did back then. I'll talk a little bit about some of the ups and downs of farming through the years. My grandfather, Ira Pontius, on the farm managed to struggle through the Depression, and when some farms, you know, some farmers lost their farms. The farmers that were paying for their farms didn't, you know, on a farm you had plenty to eat, you know, with the meat and the garden. But if you had payments, well, that was a different story. And so thousands of farms went under at that particular time. And so we were lucky that my grandfather was able to proceed. There were various ups and downs on the farm. The worst thing that happened on the farm was when my dad died at age 65. He had a first cousin that was the same age that grew up in the same neighborhood, who lived 30 years longer than he did. And so, but my brother was there to take over the farm, and so it worked out. And then in 1999, when I had moved back on the farm, the worst storm in the farm history hit and blew down 2 barns, 2 large barns and a garage and a lot of trees. And I remember the neighborhood and a lot of people in the community came right up and immediately and helped clean the place up. And I remember thinking, well, this is a wonderful place to come back to have a community that would do this kind of thing. But my brother survived that and built another barn with insurance, and he went strong. But there was a time in 1986 when my brother was buying some more land adjacent to our farm, and interest rates went up as high as maybe 18%, and he was caught in the trap there, and he couldn't he couldn't make the payments, and so he lost those 2 farms. And he had, in April 1986, he had to have a public sale for everything he had, all of his implements. And it was about the worst thing that could happen, you know, to a farmer. And I suppose the character of a man comes through when you're able to overcome mistakes like that and bad luck and move ahead and do better than you ever thought possible, which is what happened with my brother. And so there were those ups and downs in this long history of our farm, which was like 180 years. And my great-great-grandfather, Joseph Waugh, bought the farm in 1835. And so my brother is the fifth generation, and now his daughter Robin is married to John Kleiman, who has taken over the farm now. And I assume that sooner or later that they are going to live there on the farm, you know, when my brother passes on. But here's an example of, despite some of the tragedies and bad luck on the farm, there was one of those interesting highlights back in 1949 when the Purdue State Farm Management Tour came to our farm, and I think 1,200 people were there, and interviewed my father and our family in front of the on a wagon in front of the people. And I have a letter from the chairman of the Department of Agriculture in Purdue University thanking us for having it there. Can I read that letter now? Okay. He writes, you have a splendid farm and a nice story you tell. I am certain that as a result of our stop at your place, many farms in Indiana will be better run during the years ahead. It is always refreshing to see people such as you who have made such a genuine success of their business and who are at the same time making such a substantial contribution to good community life in the areas where they live. Your generosity in permitting us to come to your farm last week has once again placed Purdue University in your debt. With very good wishes for years ahead, I am sincerely Earl Butts, head of the department.
Well, Earl was Secretary of Agriculture.
Earl Butts was Secretary of Agriculture later on. So that was a nice thing to happen. And
do you remember farming with horses?
I got a picture in a book here of the last two horses, and they were sold in 1944. And I remember my dad saying that he never really liked horses, and so he was happy to get rid of them, I guess. And the first tractor was a 1020. I guess that was an International. And the second was an International F12. And so I don't remember, of course, a lot of that since I was born in 1939. One thing I remember is that through the years, off and on, we, like a lot of farmers, had hired help, and part-time at least, and this house where I live in now was where some of them used to live when the family moved up in the larger house where my brother lives now. Electricity came in 1937 to our farm, which is probably one of the first years that electricity came to rural areas here in this county. And my two grandfathers, Ira Pontius and Frank Goodridge, my mother's father, were on the first board of directors of the REMC. And so family participation in the community was went quite a ways back.
How did electricity change the way you farmed? What are some of the impacts on electricity?
Well, I think one of the first things they did was run a line to the barn where they could get automatic water, and I can't remember all the good things, but it was a drastic change, you know. Very drastic, and I still have the kerosene lamp that my grandfather used to get up 4 or 5 in the morning and milk the cows with in the barn. And one thing I've learned, I used to couldn't believe that my grandfather would get up at 4 or 5 in the morning, even when it was 0 weather, and try to milk the cows. And then one of my 93-year-old cousin told me when she used to milk the cows when she grew up on a farm, at that when it was 0, and she said that actually in a barn full of cows is actually warms up pretty well, and it's not so cold. And when you get up close to a cow when you're milking her, that big animal puts off a lot of heat, and so it's not as bad as it sounds. But it was not an easy life. I imagine my grandfather and my father, there were times when they didn't feel like getting out there and milking the cows, but they did. And I assume sometimes that the wife had to go out and do that if the farmer was not feeling well. But they also had hired hands.
Do you remember when you got your first milkers? So you had electricity to run?
No, I don't remember that, but no, I don't.
Do you remember when you got your first indoor bathroom at the home?
No, I don't remember that either. I do remember that the original outhouse was left up there for many years, and with a long sidewalk, maybe a couple 100 feet from the house. What I do remember is the feeling that as time went on with improvements in farming and implements, that I got the feeling that there was always a little progress as time went on, and a few more cows, and better productivity. A big thing with my father was Purdue record books. And they were very detailed. My grandfather started that back around 1929 or so, Purdue record books, and he and my father faithfully kept those books up until 1974, when my brother took over the farm, and my father was sick with leukemia. And my brother at the time thought that it was too complicated and didn't pay off enough to spend that much time keeping records, because the records were just so detailed, you know, the names of cows even in some of the record books, and those record books were saved, and all the expenses, every expense, and every everything they earned was put in the record books. And I remember my dad on a Sunday afternoon spending 2 or 3 hours filling up those record books. And I remember seeing them, the record books, compare how you ranked with other farms your size in the general vicinity in Northeast Indiana, so you could see how you're doing. And when the year was over with, someone from Purdue would come up and talk to the farmer and how they could possibly improve things. My father was really big on consulting with the local county agent in about how to do things. They were very close, and he and other Purdue professors, I assume, research people, would come to our farm now and then and discuss ways that the farm could be improved. And my father was not someone with, you know, a big ego. He was quite willing to listen to how he could do better and find out what his mistakes were. And so that kind of attitude paid off. And so there was always this close relationship with Purdue. And when my father first started out farming, he took short courses at Purdue. And my brother did the same thing. And their lives paralleled so much. They both spent their whole lives on the same farm. And when my father started out, one thing he did was dig graves at the church nearby, and that was part of their income, because that was a time when money was hard to come by. He carried mail. He was a substitute mail carrier. And he did that for, I would say, he probably stopped doing that in 1943 or so. And when my brother started out farming, he did the very same thing. And because there were times when you really needed that money starting out, and he found out eventually that being a substitute mail carrier, like, was sometimes in May for 2 or 3 weeks when he needed to be planting crops. And so he quit for a while, and then when things got bad in the 80s, they decided that he probably should go back to doing that. But his wife, Betty, decided that was the best thing for them to do, and so she was a full-time mail carrier for quite a few years. So going back to Purdue, my sister graduated from Purdue, and my uncle on my mother's side graduated from Purdue, and so there were a lot of Purdue connections, and I guess I was the maverick of the family and never went to Purdue. And I'm really happy that I grew up on the farm, and I'm really happy for the opportunity to come back and experience kind of life as it was kind of full circle, coming back to the farm and living on it. Kind of made me realize who I really am, realize what I was when I was young, and kind of being there on the farm again, I felt that I understood the best of me in a lot of ways. And farming and living on a farm was just a very wholesome experience. And and especially back in the 1950s when I grew up, it was just kind of an ideal way to grow up, and very grateful for that. And I feel more at home now on the farm. I've been all over the world and lived all over the country, and I feel more at home here on the farm than any place I've ever lived, and which is natural. And so I will probably die on the farm and be buried at Blue River Church, where 8 of my ancestors are buried, Blue River Church Cemetery. And feel myself fortunate that happened like that.
Tell us a little bit about your book that you wrote there.
Okay. As you can probably see, I can write, or imagine I can write better than I can talk. Back in, well, to start with, there was so much information available to compile in a book, in a farm history. For example, the Purdue record books, and my mother wrote letters all her life to we kids and to others about what was going on in the farm, in part, and she always kept carbon copies of her letters, so I got hundreds of her letters there to look at, and so and then there were a lot of people to talk to about who knew my mom and dad, and so it was just a perfect, and a lot of pictures of the farm. So it was a perfect circumstance to write, and it's something I like to do. And I actually went to college and graduate school in history. So I was trained to do research in history and write history, and this was what I know best, what I knew best. And so I named the book Chronicles of Blue River Farm, an Indiana farm family of 177 years and the 5 generations. Let's see, that was, it is now 180 years. It's pretty unusual to have a farm in the same family for that long. It's the longest any one family has owned and operated a farm in Thorn Creek Township. And so there's history there, and I certainly feel it when I compiled this history book. The book is in the Indiana State Historical Library, and it is also here in the Historical Society locally, and also at the Fort Wayne Library. So, so it's available for people to look at the past and how farming was. So it's a lot of information.
Well, we thank you very much for taking the time to come in and talk to us today, John. We learned a lot about the history of your farm here in Whitley County and how you grew up on the farm, how much you appreciated the fact that you could live on a farm, which I think a lot of us are thankful for.